Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Leah, and I will be moderating this session today. I'd like to introduce Rick Gerke, Senior Environmental Safety and Health Consultant here at Alchemy. Rick has 25 years of experience in environmental, health, and safety with work in diverse industries, including food production, automotive, government and defense, chemicals, and more. Rick is a veteran EHS consultant, auditor, and trainer. Rick is a certified management system lead auditor with experience in ISO 14001, OSAS 18001, ISO 45001, and ISO 50001. Welcome, Rick. Today, Rick will give an overview of what ISO 45000 is, why we need it, who it's for, how ISO 45001 is different than OSAS 18001, how ISO 45001 works, and ways you can learn more. We'll finish up with Q&A at the end. With that, I'll hand it over to Rick to get us started.
Thanks, Leah. Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, or evening, or nighttime, or whatever it is, wherever you are. So some of the things we're going to look at first, let's talk about a few things that ISO 45001 is. It's a specification standard for an occupational health and safety management system. And by specification, that means it lays out a bunch of shells, but it doesn't tell us exactly how we do things, and it doesn't set any numerical targets. Here's a little bit of ISO nerd knowledge here, is that ISO is not an acronym. It kind of goes around sometimes that it stands for the International Standards Organization, but it's actually from the word isos in Greek for equal. So ISO 45001 was written to replace OSAS 18001, which has been around for quite a while. And if you're already certified to OSAS 18001, people that are certified know this, is that all the certificates for OSAS 18001 are going to expire in March of next year. So the rush is on. Now you can still use OSAS 18001 as a perfectly good standard for a management system, but it can't be certified after March of next year. Okay, let's look at some of the reasons why we need ISO 45001. There are certain intended outcomes that are set both by the registrar accreditation bodies and also in the standards themselves. First, naturally, the main point is to prevent injury and ill health to workers. One of the things that we want to keep in mind when we're talking about ill health, and if you're just getting started with the implementation of the standard, according to the definitions in the standard, ill health also includes mental health. So we want to make sure we take this into account in the system. And the other is to provide safe and healthy workplaces. And if you're in the United States, we already have to do that under OSHA. Okay, more intended outcomes. Continual improvement of occupational health and safety performance is something where the standard takes us beyond compliance. Now, when the compliance regulations under OSHA in the United States, or your state OSHA, if you're in a state plan state, specify things we have to do to conform with the standards. But the idea with a management system under ISO 45001 is to take us beyond compliance and keep on improving our OH&S performance over time. Another one is fulfillment of legal requirements and other requirements. And if you're working with ISO 14001, you'll see that that term has been changed into compliance obligations, but it really means the same thing. It's fulfillment of requirements that come from the law and other requirements which might come from customers, corporate, our neighbors, or whoever it is. And also we need to achieve our OH&S objectives. Okay, here's just a few statistics. In 2017, just in the United States, there were 5,147 worker fatalities. About 2.8 million non-fatal injuries and illnesses, and about a third of those resulted in lost time. 2017 work injury costs are estimated to be about 161.5 billion, and these are only the direct costs. This isn't counting things like the social cost and the human cost. Another statistic is that federal OSHA, this is just federal, not state plan, only has 2,100 inspectors compared to 130 million workers in the US. So what this does is show us that we can't depend on the regulators to do everything. We can't count on them to be there and tell us whether our safety programs are good or whether they're in compliance. And having a systematic management system helps us do that for ourselves. I apologize, my mouse is being a little touchy here. So going beyond compliance, if we've got a process-based management system, number one, it helps us protect health and safety of workers and anybody else that's in our workplace. It helps out morale because people that are working in our organization know that their company is taking care of them. This in turn reduces turnover. We have better retention rates and spend less time retraining people, rehiring, and everything else. It helps us get in compliance if we're not, and then stay in compliance and be aware of our compliance status. Helps us avoid fines, which can go anywhere from a few thousand just if there's a legal infraction, and well up into the millions if somebody actually gets hurt. It can help us reduce our total incident rates, which is one of our indicators we want to look at, and also reduce our workers' comp costs and other costs that come in when we have injuries and illness in our workplace. Okay, let's look a little bit at who ISO 45001 might be for. Off to the right there, you'll see the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, which is also known as the Deming cycle or the Shewhart cycle. And this is the model used by ISO standards to drive continual improvement. As far as who can use ISO 45001, it can literally be anyone. Since I started getting into this business, I've been to ice cream factories, pizza factories, dog food, military organizations, aircraft maintenance, repair, and overhaul facilities, office buildings, car parts, you name it. Anybody can use this if they want to provide a safe and healthy workplace, prevent injuries, eliminate hazards. Of course, we want to eliminate them completely if we can. If we're not able to eliminate them, then we need to minimize the associated risk. ISO 45001 is very much aimed at taking advantages of opportunities, and it has a lot of components in it that make us examine our opportunities, identify what they are, evaluate their potential, and implement some kind of a process so that we can pursue them. Proactively and systematically improving OH&S performance, we want to be able to make sure that we're always doing that and that we always have some kind of an objective, and demonstrate conformance to a recognized standard. In this case, the old standard is going to be gone pretty soon. And if we want to either be able to demonstrate to ourselves or sometimes to a customer, we can have a registrar come in and do a third-party audit and issue a certificate. Sometimes the certificate is something that we want for ourselves. Sometimes after there's been an accident or an environmental release, there might be a consent order where certification becomes necessary. Or you might want to have a second party or a self-declaration or whatever. But either way, this is a standard that anybody in the world can look at, and it's the same for everybody. Okay, let's look at some of the differences between ISO 45001 and OSAS 18001. There are a lot, but some of the main ones. The first one is the structure. When the last round of standards came out, the writers decided to follow a similar structure, which is found in Annex XL. So if you put ISO 14001, 45001, 50,001 or whatever up side by side, you're going to see that they follow the same structure and they use a lot of the same language. The definitions are the same. So if you're implementing systems under more than one standard, it can help you organize things and take advantage of similarities between the standards. Some of the policy requirements are different. There's a set of shalls for required content in the safety policy and the standard. So make sure that if you've already got a policy, be sure that you put the two up side by side and make sure everything's there. Incorporation of context, very important for both ISO 45001 and 14001 if you're doing that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. ISO 45001 includes more specific duties for your top management personnel, so you want to make sure that they're aware of them. More worker involvement than in the previous standard, and there's a focus on risk and opportunity management rather than preventive action. So a lot of parts of the standard talk about risks and opportunities and managing them, so very important. There's more of an influence on the supply chain, where now in the past, most of the time when these standards were being implemented, we focused on just what was going on inside the factory walls. But ISO 45001 now helps us expand the influence of our management system so we can achieve more opportunities for improvement. And the requirements are a little more complex. Sometimes you have to jump around more when you're looking at the shells because they'll refer to other parts of the standard, and there's just more to it. Okay, so moving ahead, We'll look at some of the ways ISO 45001 works, and that's going to be in the requirements sections. Now we're just going to hit these at a high level during this webinar, and we'll expand on them later, but for now we're just going to go over the main clauses, which is context, leadership and worker participation, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, and improvement. Okay, context. Like I was saying before, this is something that's new to the standards, and it's something that we need to do up front so that we understand where we're working, what's around us. If you've read the book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, he talks about the circle of concern and the circle of influence. And if we think about context as our circle of concern, that's everything in the world that could possibly affect our system's ability to achieve our intended outcomes. It can be the climate, it can be global economics, governments, the economy, markets, neighbors, everything that's around us. So when we're first going through to set down our management system and find out what we're dealing with, we're going to want to identify all of those things that we can. In other words, the internal and external factors that can influence our ability to do what we want to with our management system. Now, one of the things that you'll see as you get into the standard is that there are a lot of places in there where the standard doesn't require documentation. And context is one of them. It says you shall identify your context, but it doesn't say to write it down. I'm recommending that anything that you have to think about while you're putting your system together, document it, because the process of identifying your context is going to provide outputs that are inputs to the next part. So then we start looking at interested parties. And an interested party is anyone who either could be affected by our system and our processes or thinks they could be. It could be a group of people or a person. We need to identify internal and external parties. External parties could be the government, your regulators, your local township, the neighbors, the other companies in the industrial park, and so on. Interested parties can be, of course, your workers, your management. You might consider your corporate people, your customers, your suppliers, your contractors, visitors, anybody who could be affected by the management system. That's our circle of influence. So when we're determining our scope, we want to be able to get our arms around exactly what the system is going to manage. Now, the word scope typically comes up in 2 places when we're talking about management systems. There's a certificate scope, which says design, manufacture, distribution, and sale of pizzas or whatever, something like that. It just basically says, here's our product. The system scope describes the boundaries, the processes, and the functions of what the system's going to manage. So by identifying the context and all the interested parties, those 2 things, if we think about those as our circle of concern and our circle of influence, that helps us document the boundaries between the things and have a nice, neat scope that everybody can look at it and read it, and they can say, okay, I know what this system covers. The management system clause, that just basically states that you have to have a management system. I've never written a finding against it, but it just is a general statement that if you want to meet the requirements of the standard, you have to document and implement and maintain a system. Next section has to do with leadership and worker participation. In the past, the standard the OSAS 18001 standard mentioned top management responsibilities in a few places, but now there's an entire section with a fairly long list of bullets of responsibilities that are specific for top management. So you'll want to make sure if you are the top management that you're familiar with this part of the standard and that you know what all of your responsibilities are. The occupational health and safety policy is something that does have to be documented. And basically the policy part is saying, this is our intent. This is how we want to take care of our people. The standard has some specific requirements for the content. You can add anything into it that you want to, but there's some of the policy content that has to be there. And this is the way we're going to communicate to ourselves, workers, visitors, contractors, the public, and everybody else that basically this is our attitude towards occupational health and safety. This is what we want to do. For roles, responsibilities, and authorities, we want to make it clear exactly who is supposed to be doing what. within our system, what authority they have, what their responsibilities are, what their roles are, how they interact, and then we want to communicate them to everybody that works there so everyone knows what everybody else is supposed to be doing. Worker consultation and participation has been strengthened in ISO 45001 in that consultation means that people have to be consulted. We have to go talk with them when we're going to make a decision. Participation means that they actually participate in the decision making. So this has been strengthened here. Also, for consultation and participation, this involves workers and workers' representatives, which could be, for example, their committee, or it could be their union if they're unionized, or anybody else that might be involved and is considered an interested party. Okay, the next section, and this is a big one. Excuse me just a second, I think I skipped a slide. Nope. Okay, so planning, this is where we're going to decide what we're going to do. Spoke before about risks and opportunities. Risks are things that could go wrong when there's uncertainty, and opportunities are just that. It's an opportunity where there might be a way we can improve our occupational health and safety performance. So remember I said before when I was talking about context and interested parties, the output of the process for identifying our context, identifying our interested parties, and finding out what their needs and expectations are going to lead us to find risks and opportunities. One of the things when we're identifying all those interested parties, we need to find out what are their needs, what are their expectations, and then when we know what their needs and expectations are, we have to decide whether we're going to do anything about them. You know, if that interested party is a regulator, we don't have any choice. We have to do it. If it's our corporate headquarters and they've got an expectation, we have to do it. But it might be the union, or it might be a neighbor, someplace where you have to make a decision on, yes, we can do that, or no, we can't. If we decide yes, we can, and yes, we are, then it becomes one of our legal and other requirements. Okay, next part is hazard identification. That's pretty clear. Everybody knows what hazards are, but do read the definition. Keep in mind that the word hazard includes something that could cause negative impacts on, could cause injury and ill health. Remember that ill health includes mental problems, and I see this getting skipped a lot of times, so make sure you include that when you're doing your hazard ID. Once we've identified all of our hazards, we need to assess the associated risk and find out both before and after controls what are the real risks so we know what we need to control. Then we assess our opportunities and find out where is there an opportunity for improvement that we have identified somewhere, and we might want to either implement some kind of a control or a training process, or potentially set an objective that we want to work on. Determination of legal and other requirements. This is part of this process. It's going to need output from the process of identifying context and interested parties. So we need to find out what are illegal requirements, and at least we've got OSHA to start with in the United States, but then you might have a state plan state, you might have something local, you might have a customer requirement that relates to safety and health, you might have a union requirement. So we want to find out what all those are and write them down. Planning action is where we decide, okay, we've decided what the hazards are, what the risks are, what the opportunities are, what the legal requirements are, and so on. Okay, now how are we going to take care of all that? How are we going to implement our system to make sure all those things happen like we want them to? OH&S objectives, that's a target we want to hit, basically some kind of a result. We want to get our recordable incident rate down. We want to get our lost time injuries down. We want to have fewer ergonomic incidents. Whatever it is, when we're doing these systems, we always want to have some kind of an objective active that's consistent with the commitment to continual improvement. Okay, resources. Now we've got a good idea of what we want to do, and the standard requires us to have the resources to do it. So for all these parts of our system, we have to figure out what it's going to take. Objectives is one place where it's very specific. We have to decide what resources we need, what plans we need, and write them down. The resources cover everything. It's training, it's educated people, it's capital for equipment, it's maintenance, it might be consulting or whatever it is, but we need to determine what resources we need to maintain the system, and then top management has to provide those. Competence and awareness. These are both things where the standard doesn't come out and give us instructions on how competent people have to be or what training they need to have. So it's up to whoever's implementing the system to determine what the competence needs are to make sure that we're in conformance with everything that we said we're going to do. Some places the law might tell us if you're going to have somebody operating this kind of equipment or driving this kind of a vehicle, they've got to have a certain level of expertise or training or a certificate like that. So you can see how all the different components of this system are interrelated and independent. So I'll say again, a lot of places where the standard does not require documentation, you might want to have documentation anyway, because you want to be able to connect the outputs from one process to the inputs of another process. Same thing with awareness. Your system, based on your hazards and risks, legal and other requirements and so on, are going to guide your decisions on who needs to be aware of what. The standard requires us to have processes for both internal and external communication. So internal communication can be a lot of different things, but you'll want to decide in your system what you want to communicate, who you want to communicate it with, when and how, and all of that. And the same thing with external communication that relates to safety and health, whether it's with the regulators or the government or your customers, suppliers, contractors, and everything else. That you want to have a plan for that that specifies how it's supposed to be done. Documented information became more flexible with the change from OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001. In the past, the 18001 standard required that the system documentation included a description of the main elements and provided direction to related documents. That requirement went away both in ISO 45001 and ISO 14001. One of the things that I've seen happen is organizations that go, hey, we don't have to have a manual anymore. Well, maybe you don't have to, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea. And here's kind of the way I look at documented information in a system. Sometimes people have too much of the information in their head. And then if somebody hits the Powerball jackpot and leaves, gets promoted, retires, gets abducted by aliens or whatever, all of a sudden they're gone. And the people who are left there in the organization are trying to navigate the system without a map. So if you have to err, I would err in the direction of more documentation than less. Okay, operational planning and control is next. So up to here, we've identified context, we've found our legal requirements, we've identified our scope, we know what our hazards are, we know what our risks are, and we know what our opportunities are. So we've decided what we needed to do. Now we need to implement operational controls and plan out how are we going to eliminate hazards, and if we can't eliminate them, how are we going to minimize the risk? And this is where your operational control procedures come in. It has to do with training, it has to do with lockout, tagout procedures, everything that controls all of those risks and hazards that we identified during the planning stage. This is where we decide how we're going to do them. Management of change also needs a procedure. There's got to be something in the system that makes sure anytime we are changing or we're planning to change something that we account for that in the system. And all those things that we've talked to up until now get applied to that change before it actually happens and potentially introduces a new risk into the workplace. Procurement is now covered. One of the things that the 14,001 and 45,001 standards both do is push the influence of the management system outside the plant walls. So now we also have to look at those potential health and safety hazards and risks that have to do with things like outsourced processes, purchased goods, contractors. Remember to look at temps, not just what we're doing ourselves on our own machinery and with our own equipment, but we're also looking at how this could possibly extend it outside, and it gives us more opportunities for improvement in health and safety overall. Emergency preparedness and response. No real difference here between OSAS 18,001, 45,001. We need to figure out when we're going through and identifying all of our hazards and risks, what kinds of things could come up in an emergency situation, and what are we going to do about it if it does? Okay, I want to talk just briefly here on the topic of operation. And some of you may have seen this already, but both in OSHA and ISO 45001, there's a strong emphasis on using the hierarchy of control when we're working up on eliminating hazards and minimizing risks. Usually, people think about safety and talk about safety. If you Google safety, you're going to get a bunch of pictures of hard hats and safety boots and vests and goggles and all kinds of stuff like that. But what we want to do first is eliminate that hazard. For example, if we're using some kind of a hazardous chemical in one of our processes, or if there's a dangerous machine that could potentially cause an amputation, first we got to decide, do we really need that thing or that stuff in here? Can we get rid of it? And if the answer is yes, then it goes. We can really do without the process. So that's elimination. If we can't, then the next thing we want to look at is substitution. Is there a safer machine or is there a safer chemical that will do the same job just as well, only as less of a risk to our people? So if it's possible, then we do it. If that still can't happen, then we go to engineering controls, which means we have to make some kind of a change on what we have. For example, say there's a machine that's dangerous. It's got sharp blades, it's got pinch points and things like that. An engineering control for that could be a light curtain or machine guards. Or in the case of a hazardous chemical, we might have an air extractor over a fume hood or something like that. That way we're still using the same chemical, but we're keeping it separated from the people with engineering controls. If there's no way to do that, for example, people have to work too close to whatever the hazard is, then we use administrative controls. For example, we put up signs or we train people to handle it in a certain way so they're not going to get hurt. PPE is the very last resort we want to use. That's when we can't eliminate, we can't substitute, there's no possible engineering control. It doesn't matter if you train people, they're still going to get hurt. So that's when the PPE comes in: gloves, hard hats, coveralls, safety shoes, and everything else. Okay, since we've had this system in place for a while and everything's going real well, we need to evaluate performance and find out whether all this effort's paying off or not. So the first part is we've got monitoring, measurement, analysis, and performance evaluation, which covers a lot of things. For example, if we have a objective to reduce our recordable incident rate, monitoring is simply counting. If we have a requirement to determine how much noise people are being exposed to, then measuring noise levels is potentially part of our industrial hygiene program. But this is where everything that we've put in place, we need to have some kind of a way to find out whether it's working or not. Evaluation of compliance means evaluating our own compliance with our legal and other requirements. And so this is a place where you want to have lots of detail in your documentation and make sure when you're doing that evaluation of compliance that it includes all of those legal and other requirements that we identified earlier in the standard. The standard doesn't say how to do this, doesn't say how often, doesn't say who does it or whatever. A lot of organizations will do it internally. It doesn't have to be done all at once, but it does have to be done periodically and it has to be documented. The next thing is internal audit, and there's no real change between the internal audit requirements in ISO 45001 from what we had in OSAS 18001 or ISO 45000 or 14001, sorry. We're just basically doing an internal audit of ourselves against the requirements in ISO 45001, but remember, it also requires an internal audit against the other requirements of the management system. So the standard itself is a minimum for the internal audit, but we also need to look at anything that we've added in that goes above and beyond the requirements in the standard. The management review process is the same as you've seen. This just means that top management, in other words, whoever's got the authority to spend money and approve and disapprove things, has to maintain awareness of how the system's working. Because if we go back to that leadership section, top management's got a big list of bulleted responsibilities. The management review is going to tell them, is this working or not? Am I meeting all my commitments? Are we attaining our targets? Are we in compliance with the law, and so on? Okay, improvement. You see, if you've seen some of these standards before, we used to talk about preventive action. That's gone now. Same thing in ISO 14001. Instead, we've gone from having that preventive action component in there, and we've gotten more proactive with it by addressing risks and opportunities up front. So when we talk about this part of the standard, we're looking at incident investigation and nonconformity and corrective action. The requirements here are pretty much the same. One focus area now is that there's more focus on looking around anytime there's been a problem, at looking around an organization or a facility or a group of facilities and finding out if that situation could possibly exist, and then applying that corrective action elsewhere to keep it from happening again someplace else. Continual improvement is that's kind of the wrap-up clause, and now it's just basically saying that we have to have continual improvement. That's one of the intended outcomes in the standard. So here's where we find out: are we actually attaining improvement in OH&S performance? You know, we can change processes, we can get more training and everything, but are we actually getting results? Okay, so just a few takeaways. PPE should always be considered the last line of defense, not the first. I always like to kind of hammer on that just to make sure that it's, you know, we want to use the hierarchy of controls. Now, if you're looking to either be conformant with ISO 45001 and you want to get certified, if you've got a good safety culture and you're already in compliance with the environmental regulations, you're probably pretty close to being there. It's going to be mostly a matter of paperwork. It's an extension of what you're already doing anyway. It's just formalizing and documenting it. Now, there's no requirement in the accredited certification rules that you have to be 100% in compliance to get certified. In fact, if you are having some compliance issues that you're working with, implementing one of these systems will help you get back in compliance and stay in compliance. Implementing one of these systems properly takes a lot of planning, and it does need the involvement of everyone. That's where we're talking about consultation and participation. We want to get everybody involved, get a lot of good ideas, and end up with better results. Better communication, training, and tracking is vital to all of this. Okay, this was just a kind of a 50,000 foot view. In the next webinar series, we're going to start digging into the details back in those requirement sections and talk about participation from each group within your company. The next webinar is scheduled for August 28th. So if you have some colleagues that might benefit from this information, please have them watch this recording and then sign up for the August 28th session. And then we'll announce the dates for these other ones when we get a little closer to the time for them to happen. Alchemy drives safety, quality, and productivity with different kinds of training, reinforcement, and compliance solutions. We have multilingual courses, wherever you are. We can get somebody in there and a process in there that'll fit your workforce. They're customizable for EHS, food safety, leadership, and operations, and you can train 150 employees at once on them. Our reinforcement solution, which is called the Coach app, increases supervisor-employee interactions and communications out on the floor and validates employee training. Our training coordinating signage reinforces key topics to keep training on top of the mind. We have real-time tracking, compliance tracking, documentation, and reporting to verify training attendance, comprehension, correct application on the floor, reinforcement, and corrective action, both for your internal use and in case you might need to demonstrate some kind of compliance with a regulatory body. We also offer consulting that's related to this standard and some others, ISO 14001, 45001. We can do gap analyses, help you develop a program, conduct your internal audits, help you with your continuous improvement programs, including corrective action. If you're upgrading from OSAS 18001 to 45001, we can help with that. We also provide regulatory assistance in the form of compliance assessments, mock OSHA audits, assist with program development, and we can also help with corrective actions, both for your management system and also, for example, if you have a notice of violation from a regulatory agency in safety, we can help you develop a corrective action. We also provide on-site training, the OSHA 10-hour and 30-hour courses, and training on the 14,001, 45,001, 18,001 transition, and other management system standards. We can also help you with environmental management, both with EPA and your state and local environmental programs by doing compliance assessments, mock audits, and again, program development and enforcement response if you happen to get an NOV. We also provide services related to SQF, BRC, and FSSC 22000. We can also help you develop HACCP plans and conduct food safety plan reassessments.
So thank you, Rick. And thanks everyone today for your time. Rick put a lot of work in this presentation, so we appreciate you doing that, Rick. But for everyone who joined us, thanks, and we hope that you'll join us again. Thanks, Rick.
Thanks, Leah.